The lawyer's briefcase clicked open with surgical precision as Karen's satisfied smirk spread across her face. She'd brought the cavalry to crush the nobody who dared challenge her, until Marcus pulled out a single piece of paper that made her blood drain from her cheeks. "You might want to see this," he said quietly, watching 20 years of her arrogance crumble in real time. "Because sometimes, the person you've been tormenting owns the very ground you're standing on." The black Mercedes pulled into the gravel parking lot of Willow Creek Community Garden with the authority of a conquering army. Marcus Chen looked up from where he knelt among the tomato plants, dirt still clinging to his weathered hands, and felt his stomach tighten. He'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since Karen Whitmore had escalated their dispute beyond neighborhood complaints to what she called legal action. The car door slammed with expensive finality. Karen emerged first, blonde hair, pulled into a severe bun, designer sunglasses reflecting the afternoon sun, her crisp white blazer unmarked by the honest labor that stained Marcus's clothes. Behind her, a man in a charcoal suit stepped out, adjusting his silk tie with the practiced motion of someone who made his living in courtrooms. "That's him," Karen's voice carried across the garden plots, sharp enough to cut glass. "The one who thinks he owns this place." Marcus stood slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans. Around him, other gardeners, Mrs. Rodriguez tending her peppers, old Tommy watering his beans, Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the name, weeding her herb plot, all froze in their work. The Saturday afternoon peace of the community garden suddenly felt as fragile as the butterfly that had been resting on his marigolds. "Mr. Chen." The lawyer's voice was smooth, professional, with just enough condescension to make it clear he considered this beneath his usual clientele. "I'm Jeffrey Harrison, attorney for Ms. Whitmore. We need to discuss your illegal occupation of this property." Karen stepped forward, her smile sharp as a blade. "Finally, Jerry. This has gone on long enough." She gestured dismissively at the carefully tended plots, the small tool shed Marcus had built with his own hands, the memorial bench dedicated to his late wife Emma. All of this unauthorized construction, these shanties. It's bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood. Marcus felt the familiar burn in his chest, not anger, exactly, but something deeper. The same feeling he'd carried for 3 years, since the day after Emma's funeral when Karen had first marched over to complain about his unsightly gardening project. "Ms. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the tremor in his hands. "As I've told you repeatedly, this garden is perfectly legal. We have permits for permits." Karen's laugh was like breaking glass. "From who? The city that's been too lazy to enforce zoning laws?" Jerry here looked into it. "This land is zoned residential, not agricultural. What you've done here." She swept her arm toward the plots where dozens of families grew vegetables to supplement their grocery bills, where kids learned where food came from, where lonely widowers like Marcus found purpose in nurturing life from soil. "Is a clear violation." Harrison opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. "Mr. Chen, we have injunctions prepared. Cease and desist orders. Ms. Whitmore is prepared to pursue this matter through the courts if necessary, but we are hoping for a reasonable resolution." "Reasonable?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He looked around at the other gardeners, who had moved closer, forming an unconscious semicircle of support. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her 5-year-old granddaughter's hand. Tommy leaned heavily on his walking stick, his face pale. These weren't just garden plots, they were lifelines. "The reasonable thing," Karen said, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal ice blue eyes, "would have been for you to ask permission before turning this lot into your personal farm. But since you didn't, now you get to tear it all down. Every illegally built structure, every unauthorized planting. I want this lot cleared and restored to its natural state within 30 days. Natural state? Marcus almost laughed. "Karen, when I started this garden, this was a vacant lot full of weeds and trash. Drug dealers used it as a meeting spot. Kids couldn't play here safely. Now look at it." And it was beautiful. 3 years of backbreaking work had transformed the half-acre lot into something that belonged in a magazine. Neat rows of vegetables stretched toward the afternoon sun. Fruit trees Marcus had planted formed a natural windbreak along the north edge. The paths he'd laid with reclaimed brick wound between plots bursting with life. A small greenhouse built from salvaged windows stood in the corner, where seedlings waited for spring planting. "I don't care if you turned it into the Garden of Eden," Karen snapped. You don't own this land. You had no right to do any of this without permission from the actual property owner. Harrison nodded gravely. Ms. Whitmore has done extensive research into the property records. The current owner of record is, he consulted his papers, Evergreen Development LLC, a company that's been unresponsive to Ms. Whitmore's attempts at contact, which is why we're addressing the issue directly, with you as the apparent caretaker of this operation. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd been dreading this conversation for months, but not for the reasons they assumed. He glanced toward the tool shed, where a metal filing cabinet held documents he'd hoped never to need. Jerry spent weeks tracking down the ownership, Karen continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. Apparently, Evergreen Development bought this parcel 5 years ago and then just forgot about it. Typical corporate negligence. But that doesn't give you squatters' rights, Mr. Chen. This is still theft of services, illegal construction, probably a dozen building code violations. The building codes were waived for community garden construction, Marcus interrupted quietly. I have the permits. Permits that were issued fraudulently, Harrison said smoothly, because the person who applied for them wasn't the legal owner of the property. Any permits issued without proper ownership documentation are null and void. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her granddaughter still clinging to her skirt. Senor Marcus, you never told us there was a problem with ownership. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Maria Rodriguez had been one of his first allies when he'd started the garden. Her plot provided fresh vegetables for her family of 6 on a tight budget. Her husband worked 2 jobs and still barely kept them afloat. The money saved on grocery bills made the difference between paying rent and facing eviction. There's no problem, Maria, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Karen's smile was triumphant. Oh, but there is a very big problem. You see, Mr. Chen has been playing landlord with property that doesn't belong to him. Every permit he helped you people get, every agreement you signed with him about plot assignments and garden rules, none of it is legally binding. He's been running an elaborate con game. That's not true, Sarah Chen protested. She was in her 30s, a single mother who brought her twin boys to help with her plot every weekend. Marcus never charged us anything. He organized everything as a volunteer. Free theft is still theft, Harrison observed. The fact that Mr. Chen didn't profit financially doesn't change the legal reality. He's been operating an unauthorized business on someone else's property. Tommy stepped forward, his walking stick tapping against the brick path. Son, is that true? About the ownership. Marcus looked at the old man who'd become like a father to him over the past 3 years. Tommy was 84, lived alone in a house too big for him since his wife died, and had found new purpose in growing the best green beans in the county. The pride in Tommy's eyes when he talked about his garden was worth more than any legal document. It's complicated, Marcus said finally. No, it's simple, Karen snapped. You lied to all these people. You pretended to have authority you don't have. And now, because of your deception, they're all going to lose their precious little garden plots. A murmur went through the gathered gardeners. Marcus could see the fear creeping into their faces, the fear of lost investment, wasted work, the destruction of something that had become central to their lives. However, Harrison continued in his lawyer's voice, Ms. Whitmore is not unreasonable. She's prepared to offer a compromise. Karen's smile returned, sharp and predatory. That's right. I've been in contact with Evergreen Development. They're willing to sell me this parcel for a very reasonable price. Once I own it legally, I'll consider allowing some limited gardening activity, under proper supervision and with appropriate rental fees. Rental fees. Sarah's voice was shrill with disbelief. Nothing unreasonable, Karen said smoothly. Perhaps $200 per month per plot. That would cover liability insurance, proper maintenance, legal compliance, $200. Mrs. Rodriguez gasped. Senora, I cannot afford. Then perhaps gardening isn't the right hobby for you, Karen said with mock sympathy. This is prime real estate, people. Do you have any idea what this lot is worth? I'm offering you the chance to continue your little hobby at below market rates. Marcus felt the rage building in his chest, hot and righteous. $200 per month would price out every single gardener here. Karen knew that. This wasn't about The Mercedes disappeared around the corner with a squeal of expensive tires, leaving behind the acrid smell of burning rubber and the electric tension of a battlefield. Marcus stood watching until the black car vanished completely, then turned back to find 30 pairs of eyes staring at him with expressions ranging from awe to bewilderment. "Señor Marcus," Mrs. Rodriguez said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you really own my house?" The question hung in the morning air like a soap bubble, fragile and iridescent with possibility. Marcus looked at the woman who'd become like a daughter to him over the past 3 years, Maria Rodriguez, who worked double shifts at the hospital to support her family, who brought him homemade tamales every Christmas, who'd cried when he helped her plant a memorial rosebush for her mother. "Yes, Maria," he said gently. "Willow Street Properties has owned 412 Maple for about 8 years. Now, your lease is with my property management company." But the rent," she stammered. "It's so reasonable. Below market rate for the neighborhood. I always wondered why." Tommy stepped forward, his walking stick tapping against the brick path. "Son, are you telling us you've been our landlord all this time and never said a word?" Marcus looked around at the faces of his tenants, people he'd watched struggle with job losses and medical bills, people he'd quietly helped through difficult times by deferring rent increases or overlooking late payments, people he'd protected, without them ever knowing they needed protection. "I didn't want it to change anything," he said simply. "The garden was supposed to be a place where everyone was equal, where a retired teacher and a hospital worker and a single mother could work side by side without worrying about who owned what or who owed whom." Sarah stepped forward, her twin boys clinging to her legs. "The apartment on Elm Street. That's why the landlord never raised the rent when my ex stopped paying child support. That's why I was allowed to plant flowers in the front yard even, though the lease said no alterations." Marcus nodded. Children need beauty in their lives. And gardens. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of revelation. Then Mrs. Rodriguez began to laugh, not the bitter laugh of someone who'd been deceived, but the warm, incredulous laughter of someone who'd just discovered that the universe was more generous than she dared to hope. "Dios mío," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "All this time, we thought we were just lucky to find affordable housing in a good neighborhood. But you were taking care of us." "We were taking care of each other," Marcus corrected. "That's what community means." But even as the gardeners began to process this revelation, Marcus's phone was buzzing with incoming calls. The first was from his property management company. "Mr. Chen, this is Linda from Willow Property Management. We've had some very strange calls this morning. Someone claiming to represent a Karen Whitmore, demanding copies of all our rental agreements, and threatening legal action if we don't comply. She says she's investigating housing code violations and illegal rental practices. Should I be concerned?" Marcus closed his eyes. Karen was moving faster than he'd expected. "Linda, refer all calls from Ms. Whitmore or anyone representing her to our legal department. And yes, you should be concerned. She's not investigating housing violations, she's looking for ways to hurt our tenants." The second call came while he was still talking to Linda. Then a third. By the time he'd finished explaining the situation to his property manager, Marcus had 7 missed calls and a dozen text messages. "Trouble?" Tommy asked, reading his expression. "She's not done," Marcus said grimly. "I think we are about to find out exactly how vindictive Karen Whitmore can be when she's cornered." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Rodriguez's phone rang. She answered it with a cheerful bueno that quickly transformed into confusion, then alarm. "Q. No entiendo. What do you mean? Housing inspection? We didn't request. Sigh. I understand English, but I don't understand why." She looked at Marcus with growing panic. "Tomorrow morning? But I work tomorrow morning. Can't we schedule?" "No. It has to be tomorrow." She hung up, her face pale. That was the City Housing Authority. They say they received a complaint about 412 Maple Street. Possible code violations, overcrowding, unauthorized modifications. They're sending an inspector tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Sarah's phone rang next. Then Tommy's. Within 10 minutes, every tenant Marcus owned property for had received similar calls. Emergency housing inspections, fire department visits, zoning compliance reviews. all scheduled for the next few days, all flagged as high priority due to anonymous complaints regarding public safety. Marcus felt a cold fury settling in his chest. This wasn't just about the garden anymore. Karen was weaponizing the bureaucracy against innocent families, using their fear of authority to punish them for his perceived slight against her. "She's trying to get you evicted," he said quietly. "All of you. She can't hurt me directly, so she's going after the people I care about." "Can she do that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. "I mean, can she just call the city and have them harass us?" "Anyone can file a complaint," Marcus replied. "The city has to investigate complaints, especially ones involving alleged safety violations. It doesn't matter if the complaints are made in bad faith, they still have to be addressed." Tommy's face had gone hard. "That woman is pure poison." "The inspections will be fine," Marcus assured them. "All my properties are up to code and properly maintained. But it's going to be disruptive, stressful, and expensive in terms of time off work." Mrs. Rodriguez was already calculating in her head. "I'll have to take a day off for the inspection. That's a whole shift of pay I can't afford to lose. And if they find anything, even something small." "They won't find anything," Marcus said firmly. "But this is just the beginning. She's going to escalate." His phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Jeffrey Harrison's number. "Mr. Chen," the lawyer's voice was strained, professional composure barely masking panic. "I need to speak with you immediately. There have been some developments." "What kind of developments?" "Ms. Whitmore has retained additional counsel. She's preparing to file a civil suit alleging fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She claims you deliberately concealed your identity to entrap her into making statements that could be used against her." Marcus almost laughed. "She's suing me for letting her reveal her own character." "It's more complicated than that. She's also alleging that your ownership of multiple rental properties in the neighborhood constitutes an illegal monopoly designed to manipulate housing prices and exclude certain demographics. She's calling it a form of redlining." Now Marcus did laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. Harrison, I've been providing affordable housing to working families for over a decade. My rental rates are consistently below market value, and I've never discriminated against anyone." "I know that, and you know that, but she's found lawyers who specialize in housing discrimination suits. They're claiming that your pattern of property ownership combined with the community garden represents a deliberate attempt to gentrify the neighborhood while maintaining the appearance of supporting low-income residents." Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. This was brilliant in its perversity, taking his genuine efforts to build affordable community and twisting them into something sinister. "There's more," Harrison continued. "She's filed complaints with the state attorney general's office alleging that your various LLCs constitute an attempt to hide assets and avoid tax obligations. She's also contacted the IRS to suggest an audit of your charitable deductions related to the garden maintenance." The attacks were coming from every direction now: personal, financial, legal. Karen had clearly spent the morning on the phone with every lawyer, bureaucrat, and enforcement agency she could find, painting Marcus as some kind of criminal mastermind rather than a retired teacher who tried to build something good. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said calmly, "I assume you're no longer representing Ms. Whitmore in this matter." There was a long pause. Given the irregularities in our initial research and Ms. Whitmore's subsequent actions, I felt it was best to withdraw from representation. There are ethical concerns about pursuing litigation based on demonstrably false premises. "I see. And you're calling me because I wanted to warn you. The lawyers she's hired now, they're not like me. I do real estate and contract law, generally for reasonable people with legitimate disputes. These are litigation specialists. They make their money by filing suits and forcing settlements, regardless of the merits. They're very good at making life expensive and complicated for their targets." Marcus thanked Harrison and hung up, his mind already working through the implications. Around him, the gardeners were watching with growing concern as they overheard fragments of the conversation. "How bad is it?" Tommy asked. "Bad," Marcus admitted. "She's trying to destroy everything at once. The garden, the rental properties, my personal finances, all of it." But even as he spoke, Another part of his mind was cataloging resources. 23 years of careful financial planning. Business relationships built on trust and mutual respect. A network of tenants who'd become friends, friends who'd become family. And most importantly, documentation. Emma. The Riverside Community Center had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. By 7 p.m. that evening, over 200 people packed the main hall, far more than Marcus had expected when Mrs. Rodriguez suggested they tell the neighbors what was happening. Word had spread through the community like wildfire, carried by text messages, phone calls, and the kind of face-to-face conversations that happen when people realize their entire way of life is under attack. Marcus stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces he'd known for years and others he was meeting for the first time. There was Maria Rodriguez with her entire extended family. Tommy had brought 3 of his neighbors from Oak Avenue. Sarah sat with a group of single mothers from the apartment complex on Elm Street. But there were others too, shop owners from the main commercial strip, parents from the elementary school, even a few people Marcus recognized as customers from the weekly farmers market the garden hosted. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I know this was short notice, but, Marcus." The voice came from the back of the room. He looked up to see Father Miguel from St. Catherine's, pushing through the crowd with Linda Chen, still no relation, from the local newspaper. "Sorry we are late. I brought reinforcements." Linda pulled out a digital recorder. "Mr. Chen, is it true that Karen Whitmore has filed multiple lawsuits against you for the crime of owning property in your own neighborhood?" A murmur went through the crowd, part laughter, part outrage. Marcus had called Linda that afternoon to give her the full story, knowing that controlling the narrative would be crucial in the fight ahead. "It's complicated," Marcus said. "But yes, that's essentially accurate." "And is it also true," Linda continued, "that she's weaponizing city services to harass your tenants in retaliation?" "That's what we are here to discuss." Father Miguel stepped forward. "Marcus, before you start, I think people need to understand the full scope of what's happening. I spent the afternoon making phone calls after Linda told me about this morning's confrontation. Karen Whitmore has contacted every regulatory agency in the county. Housing Authority, Zoning Enforcement, Fire Department, Health Department, even the State Environmental Protection Agency, claiming the garden is creating agricultural runoff." A wave of angry voices swept through the room. Marcus held up his hand for quiet. "She's also," Father Miguel continued, "been calling local businesses. She contacted the bank that holds the mortgages on several of Marcus's properties, suggesting they investigate him for financial irregularities. She called the contractors, who maintain the rental units, claiming Marcus was involved in some kind of housing fraud scheme. She even contacted the grocery stores that buy produce from our weekly farmers market, warning them about potential liability issues with uncertified agricultural products." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions and accusations. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying, not from sadness, but from rage. "She's trying to destroy everything." Sarah called out, "The garden, our homes, the farmers market, all of it." "Why?" someone shouted from the middle of the room. "What did we ever do to her?" Marcus waited for the noise to die down before answering. "We existed," he said simply. "We created something she didn't control and couldn't understand. Something that made her feel small and powerless. So she decided to destroy it." Linda raised her hand. "Marcus, can you walk us through exactly what happened this morning? I want to make sure I have the timeline right for tomorrow's article." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus recounted the confrontation at the garden, from Karen's arrival with Jeffrey Harrison to her final threats against the community. As he spoke, people in the crowd began sharing their own stories, years of harassment, complaints, petty cruelties they'd endured from Karen Whitmore. "She called the police on my 8-year-old for riding his bike on the sidewalk in front of her house," one mother reported. "She got my food truck permit revoked last year," added Miguel Santos, who ran a taco stand. "Claimed I was violating noise ordinances, even though I'd been operating the same route for 5 years without complaints. She tried to get our church shut down," Father Miguel added. "Complained about parking during services, noise from the children's choir, even the bell tower. We had to hire a lawyer just to keep our doors open." The stories poured out. catalogue of petty tyrannies and bureaucratic warfare waged by one woman against an entire community. As Marcus listened, a picture emerged of systematic harassment that went far beyond the garden dispute. Karen hadn't just targeted him. She'd been waging war against anyone who didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should be. The question, Tommy said, standing slowly with the help of his walking stick, is what we do about it. We fight back, Mrs. Rodriguez said immediately. But how? She has lawyers and money and connections. We are just working people. Actually, said a voice from near the back, you have something better than lawyers. Marcus looked up to see a woman in her 50s pushing through the crowd. He recognized her as Dr. Janet Walsh, who ran the community health clinic 3 blocks away. You have documentation, Dr. Walsh continued. 20 years of it, if what I'm hearing is correct. Every complaint Karen filed, every inspection she demanded, every permit she challenged, there's a paper trail. And if the pattern shows systematic harassment of low-income residents, minorities, and community organizations, that's not just bullying. That's civil rights violations. A new energy swept through the room. Linda was taking notes furiously. Dr. Walsh is right, Father Miguel said. The Catholic diocese keeps records of every legal challenge we face. If Marcus's properties have similar documentation, and the city has records of all Karen's complaints, we can prove a pattern of discriminatory harassment, finished a new voice. Marcus turned to see Detective Sarah Kim entering the room, still in her police uniform. The room went quiet. Marcus tensed, wondering if this was about the harassment complaint Karen had filed. Don't worry, Detective Kim said, reading his expression. I'm here as a neighbor, not a cop. I live on Cedar Street. That's the apartment complex Karen tried to get condemned last year for suspicious activity. The suspicious activity turned out to be 3 families sharing childcare duties. She pulled out a manila folder. I brought copies of every police report filed by or against Karen Whitmore in the past 5 years. 47 calls to 911. 31 noise complaints. 18 harassment allegations against neighbors. 12 reports of suspicious persons, who turned out to be delivery drivers, maintenance workers, or visiting relatives. The numbers hit the room like a physical force. Detective Kim continued. The department has been documenting a pattern for years, but individual incidents don't rise to the level of criminal harassment. Collectively, though. She shrugged. Let's just say the district attorney might be very interested in these records. Marcus felt something shifting in the room, not just anger anymore, but purpose. Organization. The scattered frustration of individual victims was crystallizing into collective action. There's something else, Detective Kim added. This afternoon's harassment complaint? Karen claimed Marcus threatened her with financial ruin and used his position as a landlord to intimidate her. But we have body cam footage from the officer, who responded to a disturbance call at the garden this morning. Marcus's eyebrows rose. There was a disturbance call. Anonymous tip about a verbal altercation involving threats of violence. The responding officer arrived just as Karen was leaving and recorded the whole conversation through the car window. Let's just say her version of events doesn't match what actually happened. Linda looked up from her notes. Detective, would you be willing to go on record about the pattern of harassment calls? As a private citizen expressing concerns about community safety? Absolutely. The meeting was transforming from a crisis response into something resembling a war council. People were forming committees, documentation, legal research, media outreach. Mrs. Rodriguez was organizing the tenants to coordinate their stories about the housing inspections. Father Miguel was reaching out to other community organizations that had faced Karen's attacks. Then Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed his attorney's number. Marcus, where are you? Robert Steinberg's voice was tight with urgency. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm at a community meeting. Why? Because Karen Whitmore's new lawyers just filed for a temporary restraining order. They're claiming you pose an immediate threat to her safety and asking for an emergency injunction to prevent you from operating any business within a 2-mile radius of her residence. The room went silent as people overheard. Marcus put the call on speaker. What does that mean? Sarah asked. It means, Robert's voice came through clearly, they're trying to shut down the garden, force Marcus to sell his rental properties, and ban him from operating any business in his own neighborhood. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. A collective gasp went through the room. Tommy slammed his walking stick against the floor. "They can't do that," he shouted. "This is America. You can't just ban someone from their own property." "Actually," Robert said grimly, "they can, if they convince a judge that Marcus poses a credible threat. They're claiming he has a pattern of using finer." Marcus barely slept that night. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn, Emma's reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents he'd filed away years ago. Incorporation papers for Evergreen Development LLC, property deeds, purchase, agreements, insurance policies. A carefully constructed paper trail that told a story Karen Whitmore had never bothered to investigate properly. By 8 a.m., he was back at the garden, waiting. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the plants seemed to sense the change. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, late summer flowers blazing with desperate beauty. He'd built something here. Something real and lasting and good. And he'd be damned if he let Karen destroy it. His phone buzzed. A text from Jeffrey Harrison. Meeting confirmed for 10 a.m. at the garden. Ms. Whitmore is prepared to finalize arrangements. Marcus typed back, "See you then. I have some documents you'll want to review." At 9:45, the black Mercedes returned, pulling up with the same arrogant precision as the day before. Karen emerged wearing a different designer outfit, navy blue this time, as if she were attending a business meeting rather than a garden execution. Harrison followed, his briefcase presumably loaded with eviction notices and legal threats. But this time, Marcus was ready. He stood by the memorial bench, a manila folder in his hands. Not the thick legal portfolio Harrison carried, just a simple folder with a few carefully selected documents. Sometimes the most powerful weapons were the quietest ones. "Mr. Chen," Harrison called as they approached. "I trust you've had time to consider Ms. Whitmore's generous offer." "I have," Marcus replied calmly. "In fact, I spent most of the night reviewing some paperwork. Very enlightening." Karen's smile was sharp with anticipation. "I hope you've come to your senses. My offer to purchase the property from Evergreen Development is time-sensitive. If you're going to cooperate with the transition, we need to move quickly." "About that," Marcus said, opening his folder. "I'm curious, Ms. Whitmore. When you contacted Evergreen Development, who exactly did you speak with?" Karen exchanged a glance with Harrison. That's not really your concern, is it? Jerry handled all the negotiations." "Actually, I'm very interested," Marcus continued, pulling out the first document. "You see, Evergreen Development is a rather small operation. Very small, in fact. So small that any legitimate inquiries would have been handled personally by the owner." Harrison stepped forward, his professional smile beginning to crack. "Mr. Chen, I'm not sure what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Marcus said, handing him the document. "I'm stating facts. This is the corporate registration for Evergreen Development LLC, filed with the state 23 years ago. As you can see, it's a single-member limited liability company." Harrison's eyes scanned the paper, and Marcus watched the exact moment comprehension dawned. The lawyer's face went pale, then flushed red. Karen snatched the paper from his hands. "What is this supposed to prove? So what if it's a small company? Jerry told me they were unresponsive, probably some corporate shell that—" Her voice died as she reached the signature line at the bottom of the document. "Marcus Chen, managing member and sole owner." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus watched Karen's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and the first glimmers of panic. This has to be a forgery," she stammered. "You can't be. Jerry, tell him this doesn't mean anything." But Harrison was staring at the document with the expression of a man watching his career implode in real time. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I need to ask you again, who exactly did you speak with at Evergreen Development?" Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Marcus pulled out a second document. "This might help clarify things," he said gently. "It's the original purchase agreement when when Evergreen Development acquired this property 5 years ago." He handed it to Harrison, whose hands were now visibly shaking. "As you can see, the purchase was made with cash, no financing, no corporate partners. Just me." But you said they were willing to sell." Karen's voice rose to a near shriek. You said you'd negotiated a purchase agreement. Harrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Ms. Whitmore, I think there may have been some miscommunication in our initial research. Miscommunication. Marcus's voice was still, calm, but there was steel underneath now. Mr. Harrison, are you telling me you advised your client to pursue legal action against a property owner based on miscommunication? The lawyer's professional composure was disintegrating by the second. We. The research indicated that Evergreen Development was a non-responsive corporate entity. We attempted to make contact through several channels. What channels? Marcus asked quietly. Harrison fumbled with his briefcase, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes. We sent certified letters to the address listed in the corporate filing. Marcus nodded. And what address was that? Harrison consulted his notes. 1247 Elm Street, Suite 300. Marcus said. That would explain the problem. That building was demolished 6 years ago to make way for a shopping center. I updated the corporate address with the state 3 years ago. He pulled out another document. To this address. My home address. Karen was staring at him as if he'd grown a second head. This is impossible. You're a gardener. A nobody who worked for 32 years as a high school mathematics teacher, Marcus finished quietly. Who saved every penny of his salary, invested carefully, and used his wife's life insurance money to purchase investment properties, including this one. He pulled out the final document, a property tax bill from the county, clearly showing Evergreen Development, LLC as the owner, with payments current through the year. I've been paying taxes on this land for 5 years, Ms. Whitmore. The garden isn't an illegal occupation. It's exactly what I intended when I bought the property. A community space. A place where people could grow food, build relationships, find purpose. Karen's face had gone white. But the zoning violations. The illegal construction. Jerry said. Mr. Harrison said a lot of things, Marcus observed. Unfortunately, most of them were based on incomplete research and apparently fabricated communications with my company. He turned to the lawyer, whose face was now the color of old paper. I'm particularly curious about this alleged purchase agreement you negotiated. Since I never spoke to you, and I never agreed to sell, I'm wondering who exactly you thought you were making a deal with. Harrison's mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds. We received correspondence. Indicating. You received correspondence from whom? I may have. The initial contact may have been. Harrison was sweating now, despite the cool morning air. Ms. Whitmore, I think we need to discuss this privately. But Karen wasn't listening. She was staring at Marcus with a mixture of rage and dawning horror. You knew all along, and you let me make a fool of myself. Actually, Marcus said, I tried to tell you multiple times that the garden was perfectly legal. You chose not to listen. You preferred to assume I was some kind of squatter who could be intimidated into submission. This is entrapment. Karen shouted. You deliberately deceived us. I never deceived anyone, Marcus replied calmly. I never claimed not to own the property. I simply didn't advertise the fact. There's a difference. Harrison was frantically shuffling through his papers, apparently looking for some legal lifeline. Mr. Chen, surely we can reach some kind of understanding here. Mistakes were made in our research, obviously, but Ms. Whitmore's concerns about property values and zoning compliance are still valid, are they? Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to a saved email. Because I have correspondence here from the City Planning Department, praising the garden as an excellent example of urban agriculture and community development. They've actually asked permission to use it as a model for other neighborhoods. Karen's face was cycling through a fascinating array of colors. This is a setup. You planned this whole thing. Ms. Whitmore, Marcus said, his voice still maddeningly calm. 3 years ago, you marched onto my property and demanded I stop gardening because it was unsightly. When I politely declined, you escalated to noise complaints, code enforcement, calls, and harassment of the other gardeners. Yesterday, you brought a lawyer to threaten me with lawsuits and financial ruin. At what point in that timeline did I set you up? The truth was hitting her in waves now, and with each wave, her fury grew. You could have just told me you owned it. All this time, you let me think, what? That you could bully someone you perceived as powerless. Marcus's voice hardened slightly. That you could use lawyers and threats to destroy something beautiful. Because it inconvenienced you? You're right, Ms. Whitmore. I could have told you. But I wanted to see exactly how far you'd go. Harrison was backing toward the Mercedes, clearly recognizing that this situation had gone far beyond salvageable. Ms. Whitmore, I really think we should. How far I'd go. Karen's voice was rising toward hysteria. How far I'd go. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The stress, the expense, the what? Marcus interrupted. The expense of hiring a lawyer to intimidate people you thought were defenseless? The stress of planning to evict families from their garden plots so you could have an A. The courthouse steps looked like the scene of a political rally. By 8:30 a.m., over 300 people had gathered outside the municipal building, filling the sidewalk and spilling into the street. Marcus stood at the center of it all, watching, in amazement as his quiet neighborhood dispute had transformed into something that felt like a movement. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought her entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, and children carrying hand-painted signs reading gardens. Not greed and community over profit. Father Miguel stood with a delegation from St. Catherine's, while Dr. Walsh had assembled what looked like half the staff of the community health clinic. Tommy had somehow convinced a dozen other elderly residents to make the trip downtown, there, walking sticks and wheelchairs forming a defiant front line. But there were others too, people Marcus didn't recognize but who'd clearly heard about the case. Environmental activists with Save Urban Agriculture banners, housing advocates carrying signs about tenants' rights, even a group of high school students who'd apparently organized through social media after reading Linda Chen's article, which had gone viral overnight. Marcus. Linda pushed through the crowd, her photographer in tow. Channel 7 wants an interview. Before you go in. And the Times is sending someone. This story has legs. But before Marcus could respond, a murmur went through the crowd. The black Mercedes was pulling up to the courthouse, followed by two other expensive cars. Karen emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a conservative navy suit that screamed respectability, flanked by three lawyers in matching dark suits. They moved through the crowd like sharks through a school of fish, ignoring the shouts and questions from the gathered supporters. There she is, someone yelled. That's the woman trying to destroy our neighborhood. Karen's face was a mask of calm composure, but Marcus caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes as she took in the size of the crowd. This wasn't what she'd expected. Detective Kim appeared at Marcus's elbow. We need to talk before you go in there, she said quietly. I've been working all night, and there are some things you need to know. They moved to a quieter spot near the courthouse entrance. Detective Kim pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a series of text messages. These came from Karen's number. To various city officials between midnight and 6 a.m., she said. Demands for immediate action on housing violations, threats of political consequences if the garden isn't shut down, and, this is the interesting one, promises of campaign contributions to anyone who helps expedite the legal proceedings. Marcus stuttered the messages. She's trying to buy the outcome. It gets worse. I contacted the judge assigned to this case, Judge Patricia Morrison. Turns out Karen called her chambers at 11 p.m. last night, claiming she was in immediate physical danger and needed emergency protection. The judge refused to hear the case ex parte, but what? Detective Kim's expression was grim. Judge Morrison recused herself this morning. Apparently, Karen's husband sits on the board of a charity that the judge's wife runs. Conflict of interest. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Who's the new judge? Judge Richard Hawthorne. Let's say he has a reputation for being very sympathetic to property owners and very skeptical of what he calls community activism. As if summoned by their conversation, a Blacktown car pulled up to the courthouse. A man in his 60s emerged, silver-haired, imperious, radiating the kind of authority that came from decades on the bench. Judge Hawthorne moved through the crowd without acknowledging the protesters, his face set in stern disapproval. This is bad, Detective Kim murmured. Hawthorne issued the injunction that shut down the homeless camp last year. He also ruled against the tenants' union in the Oak Street rent control case. Marcus watched the judge disappear into the courthouse, then looked back at the crowd of supporters. 300 people who'd taken time off work, arranged childcare, and traveled downtown to stand with him. People who believed that community mattered more than property values, that gardens were more important than empty lots. Detective Kim. He said quietly, "Whatever happens in there, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If this goes badly, if the judge issues the restraining order and shuts down the garden, don't let them disperse quietly. Document everything. Make sure the world sees exactly what gets destroyed and who ordered it destroyed." She nodded grimly, already planning on it. Robert Steinberg appeared, looking harried and slightly overwhelmed. "Marcus, we need to go in. The courtroom is already packed, and I want to get you seated before." He stopped, staring at something over Marcus's shoulder. Marcus turned to see another car pulling up, not a Mercedes or town car, but a modest sedan. A woman in her 40s emerged, carrying a briefcase and moving with the quick, efficient stride of someone who fought battles for a living. "Who is that?" Marcus asked. Robert's face had gone pale. "That's Catherine Price. She's the lead attorney for Whitmore's new legal team. She specializes in slap suits, strategic litigation against public participation. She's the one who got the community garden in Riverside shut down last year." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about a systematic campaign to silence community organizing through legal intimidation. "Mr. Chen." Catherine Price's voice carried clearly across the courthouse steps. "I hoped we might have a chance to speak before the hearing." She approached with the confident stride of someone who'd never lost a case like this. Her smile was perfectly professional and completely predatory. "Ms. Price," Robert said stiffly, "I wasn't aware you were representing Ms. Whitmore." "As of yesterday evening," Price replied smoothly. Ms. Whitmore's case caught the attention of several community leaders who are concerned about the precedent being set here. Property rights, you understand. The sanctity of neighborhood character. Marcus studied her carefully. "What community?" "Leaders." Price's smile widened. "Oh, I think you'll find today's proceedings quite illuminating on that front. But I did want to offer you one final opportunity to resolve this matter reasonably." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "This is a comprehensive settlement agreement. You dissolve the garden voluntarily, sell your rental properties to a management company we'll recommend, and relocate your community organizing activities to a more appropriate venue outside the residential district. In exchange, we'll withdraw all legal actions and ensure that the various regulatory investigations are resolved favorably." Marcus looked at the document without taking it. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll discover that this case involves considerably more than a neighborhood dispute about gardening." Price's voice remained pleasant, but her eyes had gone cold. "You see, Mr. Chen, when you created your little network of properties and community organizations, you inadvertently stepped into a much larger conversation about urban development and community planning." She gestured toward the courthouse. "The judge will be reviewing evidence today that suggests your activities represent a form of unauthorized urban planning that undermines legitimate municipal authority. There are questions about tax assessments on your properties, compliance with zoning regulations, even the propriety of using residential properties to support what amounts to political organizing." Robert stepped forward. "Ms. Price, if you're threatening to fabricate evidence—" "I'm not threatening anything," Price said smoothly. "I'm simply observing that complex property arrangements sometimes reveal irregularities when subjected to thorough examination. For instance, did you know that Mr. Chen's various LLCs have been claiming agricultural tax exemptions for the garden while simultaneously operating under residential zoning permits? That's potentially fraudulent." Marcus felt the trap closing around him. The agricultural exemptions had been Emma's idea, a way to reduce the tax burden on the garden property and keep it financially sustainable. But if they could frame it as fraud— "There's more," Price continued. "The city planning department is prepared to testify that Mr. Chen never properly disclosed his extensive property holdings when he applied for the garden permits. That's a material omission that could void all his authorizations." "Those holdings weren't relevant to the garden application," Robert protested. "Weren't they?" Price pulled out another document. "When someone owns 30% of the rental housing in a neighborhood and then creates a community organization that influences local property values, That's not gardening, Mr. Steinberg. That's de facto urban planning without proper authority. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus could see how it would play to a judge like Hawthorne, a teacher who'd gotten too big for his britches, using community organizing as a cover for property speculation. You have 5 minutes to decide, Price said, checking her watch. Accept the settlement, or face the consequences of a very public legal defeat that will destroy not just your little garden, but your entire property portfolio and quite possibly your freedom. She turned to go, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Chen? That crowd of supporters you've assembled? They might want to consider whether they're comfortable being associated with someone who's about to be exposed as a financial fraudster. As Price disappeared into the courthouse, Marcus felt the weight of 20 years of careful planning pressing down on him. Every